Okay, this is Mac Bolan, and I'm getting ready to start a banged podcast here. Believers and non believers group discussion. And given the recent events, the hot button topic, so I'm going to cover Syria. And as always, I'm going to go ahead and deal with background, going to deal with facts, going to basically eliminate a lot of the ignorance surrounding the whole situation. Start with, and I'm not going to go all the way back to ancient times. I mean, I could talk about Syria, Damascus, cradle of civilization. We could go back. Let's just start with a little bit more recent history and kind of what led to the current situation in Syria. Syria back in the 60s turned into a very unstable country. Ba'athist Syria, and for those who don't know what the Ba'athist Party is, look at Iraq. Saddam Hussein was a Ba'athist. Basically, 1961, there was a coup that culminated in the 1963 Ba'athist coup. Takeover was engineered by the Arab Socialist Ba'athist Party, led by Michael Aflaq and Salah al-Din al-Bitar. Now, a new Syrian cabinet installed was by Ba'athist members. Now let's fast forward November 1970. Basically, they were all deposed, and Hafez al-Assad took over. At the time, he was the Minister of Defense. He led a coup and kind of led to a split. I mean, he was a pan-Arabist. He was if you know anything about Gamal Nasser in Egypt, I mean, he was one of the people who believed in pan-Arabism, in a united Arab caliphate that combined North Africa, Middle East, etc., into one massive combined caliphate. So anyway, Syria was involved in the 1967 Arab-Israeli war, and of course, they got their asses kicked. Fast forward into the 70s, and probably one of the biggest key events, which people know nothing about, was the Black September event with Jordan. And Syria forces actually tried to intervene and come to the aid of the Palestinian Liberation Organization in Jordan. And it actually kind of culminated in a little bit of a disagreement between Jordan and Syria. So go forward, 1973. Again, a huge event in the Middle East, again involving Israel, and that was the Yom Kippur War, where Syria and Egypt launched a surprise attack against Israel. Now, when we talk about Russian involvement with Syria, pretty much everybody sees what's going on today. Well, you have to go all the way back to the late 60s and 70s. The Soviet Union actually were huge supporters of both Egypt and Syria. If you look at the equipment, when Egypt and Syria invaded on a surprise attack against Israel in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War, their equipment was all Soviet. If you look at the T-62 tanks, the main battle tanks that both forces had, advanced. They had IR capability, meaning, they could night fight. They had missiles, mortars. All their equipment was supplied by the Soviet Union, which backed both Egypt and Syria. And they had the brand new Sagar anti-tank missile. I know a lot of people I'm talking about this who don't know military arms. I'm going way over your head. But basically, this involvement with Russia, with Syria, and in the Middle East goes way back, long before what we're talking about in this day and age. Initially, they made a lot of gains and had initial successes, but eventually Israel was able to prevail, and Syria in the end took an absolute beating as Israeli forces pushed all the way outside to Damascus. Both Jordan and Egypt ended up surrendering and eventually signed peace treaties with Israel, and subsequently were kicked out of the Arab League because of it. So we can go ahead and move on to a little bit closer. Syria, which is a Shiite country, and as Shiites, they've been closely allied with Iran. They are also supporters of Hezbollah, which is a terrorist and political organization in Lebanon. Syria was heavily involved in the Lebanese civil war and actually occupied Lebanon, particularly the northern part. And again, we're huge supporters of Hezbollah. And part of that support in the civil war and the PLO terrorism, of course, led to the Israeli invasion into Lebanon and into Beirut. And that went on for quite a while. Eventually, Syria withdrew in 2005, but continues to be a huge player in Lebanese politics and supporters of the terrorist organization Hezbollah. Again, also supported by Iran. Close ties between those countries. So now, fast forward to 2000. Hafez al-Assad died in 2000. And his son, Bashar al-Assad, was elected. And people say, oh, well, he was democratically elected. No, dumbasses. He wasn't democratically elected. He ran unopposed. I mean, it was a joke. And then, of course, his election, the Damascus Spring, an attempt at reform in Syria, basically suppressed the movement, imprisoning all the elections, really no reforms whatsoever. And again, tensions arose between Israel and Syria, terrorist events supporting terrorism, Syrian Kurds. And if you know about the Kurds exist both in northern Iraq, in Turkey, and in Syria. And that's also been contributing to the long-standing violence with that ethnic group within those countries. So technically, you can't talk about Syria without also including Iraq at this point. Now, the Iraqi war had been going on for a long time now. In 2007, prior to Bush leaving office, they instituted the surge strategy. Now, they were battling an element of Sunni element of Iraqi insurgents known as AQSM, which loosely translated means Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They were absolutely blown away in 2007. The remnants of that organization fled across the Syrian border, ended up in northern Syria, and were actually given safe haven by Assad. Now, they were able to form up with several of the other Sunni Muslims, which already existed in Syria, and with them, that formed what became ISIS. And of course, if you go into the events that happened in Iraq and the withdrawal of the U.S., and of course the ultimately completely stupid move by Obama by pulling U.S. forces out and then calling ISIS the JV team. And then, of course, by 2014, they owned 1/3 of the country. And the idiot had to deploy U.S. troops back into Iraq to prevent, a collapse of the country. Now, at the same time, in 2011, the civil war began in Syria. And the Syrian opposition was mostly Sunni Muslims, rebels. And of course, this is separate from ISIS. And probably one of the things that really needs to be cleared up here is that Assad wasn't really that concerned with ISIS. His concern was with the rebel groups. And the U.S. made a lot of mistakes during the Obama era. They tried to get involved with some of the Syrian rebel groups. They even blew $10 million trying to train and equip one of the groups that disbanded before they ever even got involved. Ended up going over to ISIS, and ISIS ended up with all their equipment. On top of that, you had the failed attempt by the Obama administration to run weapons from Libya to Syrian rebel groups. And part of that, if you don't know what that embassy annex in Benghazi was doing, well, there you have it. That was their primary focus. And one of the biggest embarrassments, of course, that the media never picked up on was that several weapons involved not just in Iraq or Syria, but even in Yemen, were weapons that were traced back to Libya that were sent over there by the Obama administration, which incidentally bypassed Congress in instituting this this weapons gun running operation. So while Obama was president, the first use of chemical weapons was in 2013. And this is after he made his famous comment about a red line, which, of course, he got called on. And he was going to do something, but then he kind of changed his mind and said, well, you know what? No, I'm going to go to Congress. And he went before Congress and said, hey, I want approval to go ahead and react to this. And of course, at the time, Congress, and I don't just mean Republicans, I mean the Democrats in Congress too, completely failed to fall in line with his actions. So civil war continued. At the same time, we started to beef up our presence in Iraq, trying to work with the Kurds and fight ISIS and drive them back. Now, at the same time, it might be noted, Iran actually sent troops into northern Iraq as well and got involved in this operation, along with the U.S., along with the Kurds, fighting ISIS. Now, it's important to note that the rules of engagement in Iraq and in Syria at the time, while Obama was president, precluded U.S. troops from actively getting involved. Purely their involvement was in an advisory role, and they were only allowed to defend themselves, which, again, was a huge mistake at this time, when they should have been pushing the initiative, when they should have been more actively involved, and we probably should have had more troops. Now, at this point, this has changed since Trump has been elected and Mattis has been installed. They've taken a more aggressive role. Now, a lot of people are wondering, oh, well, we just launched this this airstrike. Well, it was a action. He didn't go before Congress, but that's not illegal. It was totally within his rights. And by striking the air bases from where the chemical attacks were launched from, and make no mistake, they didn't dispute the fact that they launched airstrikes. What they did do was lie about the targets, And then secondly, denying the use of chemical weapons, which of course now we all know they did use. And it specifically came from these air bases, and the particular air base in question was hit by the Tomahawk missile launches. Now, this does two things. One, it's a show of force, but secondly, it makes a statement that you're not going to get away with it. And the use of weapons of mass destruction, which chemical weapons are, is banned under the Geneva Convention by the United Nations. Yet, the United Nations, which has been involved, basically in the form of humanitarian rights violations within Syria, but has never actively been involved in trying to do anything to solve the civil war in Syria. And of course, we have the heavy Russian involvement. The Russians really, they're trying to defeat ISIS, but, again, their main goal is to continue to prop up the Assad regime in Syria. Now, having said all of that, the U.S. has already escalated in the sense that they've deployed Marines to Syria. There's a brigade, 2nd Brigade from the 82nd Airborne Division in northern Iraq. And based on kind of what is happening here, you're probably going to see an increased elevation of conflict and probably operations within Syria based on everything that's happened. So before people want to, sit there and point the finger at Trump, know the facts, know the background information on all of this, and understand that we wouldn't even be in Syria in the first place if former President Obama hadn't dropped the ball in Iraq, putting us back into Iraq because of a failure to recognize the threat, the fact that Syria accepted AQSM into their territory, the birth of ISIS, the failure of Obama to realize the threat of ISIS, and then his attempt at getting involved, and again, all the things involved with Libya and with Iraq and with Syria. Before you point any fingers at what's going on right now, you have to go all the way back to that point in time. And if you want to complain about why the U.S. is involved in Syria, the Syria civil war, or ISIS in Iraq, then you need to firmly place the blame on former President Obama and his failure to deal with this situation in the first place. Because my personal opinion, we should never have gotten involved in Syria. Our main goal in the first place, and still should be, the security of Iraq, which we got rid of Saddam Hussein, and we actually have a pro-American president in Iraq right now in al-Abadi. And that should have been our focus, and that should have been our focus in the first place. As far as what's going to happen now, well, stay tuned and pay attention to the news. That's it. That's all I got to say. And if you want to debate, you want to argue, I am more than happy to dispute anything that I'm more than happy to support anything that I've said here. If you want to dispute it, I am more than happy to debate you. Have a good evening. That's it. Going to have another podcast here shortly, only I'm going to go economics on the next one. Good night.